Good afternoon everyone and welcome to the Scrutiny Management Panel meeting. I am Councillor Scott Pater Harris and I am the chair of this panel. Bit of housekeeping and safety information. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at the Queen Victoria statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with the Portsmouth Cultural Trust Fire Marshal regulations, if you have signed in before the meeting, please remember to sign out when you leave the building. Live web streaming. Fun bit. May I draw everyone's attention to the fact that this meeting will be live streamed from a camera at a fixed location at the back of the meeting room. It's in the corner there. You can all wave. And the recording will be on the council's website. I'm glad Ben and Tom did wave. Members of the public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it never disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. May I ask everyone to use the microphones provided when they are speaking, because if you don't use your microphones, they actually won't be broadcast. We'll just go round the table for introductions first. Do you want to go first? I'm Councillor Scott Pater Harris, the chair.
I'm Councillor Ian Lyon, Vice Chair. Oh. Councillor Ian Lyon, Vice Chair.
Councillor Ben Dowling, Councillor in Milton Ward.
Tom Wood, Councillor in St Thomas.
Darren Sanders, Councillor in Baffins Ward.
Steve Hastings, Councillor for Baffins also.
Leo Madden, Councillor for Nelson Ward, but here in my capacity as Chair of HOSP.
Thank you everyone. We have no deputations for today's meeting, so we will move on to declarations of members' interests. Do we have any interests? Fantastic, moving on. Apologies for absence. They've been tendered on behalf of Councillor Morgan and Councillors Galloway and Councillors Gemma New. Councillor Alicia Denny will be deputising for Gemma New, but I think she's on her way. She's not here yet, but she will be here. So you know what she's like, she will get here when she gets here. Minutes of the meeting held on the 29th of September. Just go through these. Pages 3 to 6. Page 3, does anyone have anything that doesn't sit right? No? Page 4.
Chair, so just to check that the EDCL topics on the port, have you now had your update?
Can you turn your mic off, please? I have had my update, and I'm happy to move forward with that.
Excellent, thank you.
So page 4 is agreed. Page 5. Agreed. Brilliant. Page 6, finally. Yeah, on page 6, actually, the point you've just made, Councillor Hastings, about the scope to be agreed, I've since had a briefing and I'm quite happy with it, so yeah, that is agreed.
Excellent, thank you, Chair.
Now we're going to move on to item 4, which will be the review of the recommendations RE hospital discharge arrangements in Portsmouth as outlined in the report dated 12th of December 2014. I'm going to invite Rachel Roberts to present her report, and Joe Bennett will assist with any inquiries to housing.
Hi, just to say, my name is Rachel Roberts and I'm a service manager with Portsmouth City Council, and I have responsibility for mental health services, for carers services, for safeguarding and for the hospital social work service. I was asked to produce an update to the action plan for the report dated 2014. Firstly, just to say that I took on the responsibility for the hospital service in January of this year, so I'm not in a position to comment on some of the actions that I may have taken prior to that, and I'm also conscious that I don't have the context in which this report was written. So, Chair, what I was proposing to do is to go directly to the action plan and just give an update, and then Joe can comment on a couple of the areas specific to housing, and then obviously very happy to take questions if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to proceed on that basis.
If we go to the first recommendation, which was around IT systems and communication, since this report was written, we have developed an integrated discharge service based within the hospital building now. So Portsmouth City Council staff sit along with Hampshire County Council staff, with staff from Solent NHS Trust, staff from Southern Health, and the discharge planning team, that is the Portsmouth Hospital Trust team. So in terms of accessing information, the IDS services uses an IT system called BedView, which records contemporary sort of live data about patients and progresses that they're making in terms of discharge planning. So everybody uses that system to provide an update. We still all have our own client records, which we would inevitably have to continue. The BedView system is primarily used for people whilst they're in hospital. Okay. I don't know if people want to ask questions as I go through each point. I'm happy to do that if that helps.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, actually. We'll do that from each recommendation. But any questions, members? Councillor Sanders?
Thank you. Sorry, I should also say that I chaired the panel that actually wrote the report. So forgive me if I ask questions that you may not know about. Question one. With this, you say you've got an integrated discharge service. When the report was being written, we were told that there was an integrated discharge bureau. What's the difference between the two?
From what I know of it, I think that the main difference between the two is that all services are now actually sitting together in one room. So previously, people came together for an integrated discharge bureau meeting, and I think the focus of the Integrated Discharge Bureau was around the referral processes and things coming into one place. But we now have all services sitting together in one room, and in addition to that, we have a senior manager acting as the Integrated Discharge Service lead for the whole Integrated Discharge Service, and they are funded by all partner agencies. Employed by the CCG at the moment, and that's a post that was put in place for 1 year. I'm not quite sure when it's due to come to end. I think they're obviously evaluating the value of that, and I think it has been helpful because that person, although doesn't have line management responsibility for individual services, has an overall responsibility to ensure the efficient and smooth running of the integrated discharge service.
Would you like a second question, Councillor Sanders?
Not on this topic, Scott.
Thank you. Move on to the next recommendation.
And the next recommendation related to relevant professionals being given next of kin status. It's not possible to confer next of kin status onto individuals. It's a legal title. What people can do is make arrangements with residents. I'm thinking particularly, I know this comes up a lot around sheltered housing where people go into hospital. People who've got capacity can give permission for housing scheme managers, staff, to have personal information about them in relation to their hospital discharge. That just requires them to sign something or notify hospital staff. It's not possible for a legal title to be conferred on somebody.
Any questions, members? No.
Sorry, I guess.
Okay, Councillor Lyon.
The interesting question is how it came to be that people thought they could be given next of kin status. It seems, when I read it, it seemed to me that what they were trying to do was find out who the next of kin was and to have an ability to share information with the next of kin. And it's just bizarre to think that was a recommendation from someone as sensible as Councillor Sanders. Was it not misread that actually what we were trying to do is get the relevant professionals to know who was the next of kin and for that information to be readily available?
It may be, and it may be my interpretation. I had understood it because we do have people who actually don't have any next of kin, and I know that has sometimes been an issue in terms of information sharing. They have no family members or relatives, and I think we have had situations where sometimes scheme managers have said that they were the next of kin. I think it's a term that's perhaps freely used, and it actually does have a legal basis to it. But apologies if I've kind of got that recommendation wrong.
Well, the follow-up is it says that something called Part 5.5 refers, and I'm looking at 5.3, and then there's 6 in the original report. So I don't know what 5.5 says. So I may be entirely wrong in, which is very unlikely, that, in having assumed that you've assumed something that isn't there. But it strikes me as I've never heard of anyone asking for professionals to have next of kin status. I mean, it's just so what I really want to know is what the committee, and obviously you weren't around for it at the time, but the council might be able to help me, what they thought they meant by that particular phrase, because I can't believe that you were expecting that such a thing as a legal status of next of kin would be conferred upon relevant professionals.
I'm just going to give Councillor Sanders the opportunity to answer that.
Ian, firstly, thank you for your kind compliments. I believe that's a first. And secondly, yes, I'm delighted to tell you our thinking behind what we were trying to do. Some of the sheltered housing managers felt that there was a lack of the council's sheltered housing managers felt that there was a lack of communication. They didn't get all the information they needed in order to make sure that people who were coming into their care had all the provision that was required. Therefore, they were looking for some way in which they could access all the information. At the time, we felt that the easiest way of doing that was to, and we all panel members agreed this, was to have them basically as next of kin. It then came through from the discussions we had with the predecessors of the team over there, that actually wasn't legally possible. Indeed, it was one of the points that was challenged at the Cabinet meeting of March 2015, when this was put forwards, and is the only recommendation in the report that was not supported. What we were aiming for was the ability to have more information filtered down to sheltered housing managers, because there really did seem to be, you could call it a miscommunication or a severe point of agreement between the NHS professionals on the one hand and the sheltered housing managers on the other. That was something that came from the review before I inherited the review in June 2014. But it's something that was there, and so we were trying to overcome it. Sorry, I'm being you for 5 minutes. I suspect I might be throughout this. But that was our thinking, because there did seem to be a breakdown between the NHS professionals on the one hand and the sheltered housing managers on the other. So we were trying to reconcile that by increasing the information sharing protocols. I hope that's answered your question, Ian.
Well, it has, but I wonder whether or not it occurred to the panel at the time that rather like the French have something called a gardien that was appointed by the state. I'm not suggesting we do that here. That in fact it's a really good idea, but there's a conflict of interest that exists between somebody who's running somebody else's life as a provider rather than being a next of kin. And I wondered whether or not it was explored that in fact something like that could be held in the council as a role, somebody who adopts the role as a quasi next of kin, or there being some kind of third party outsider.
I'm going to pass over to Jo Bennett, I think, on this point.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Jo Bennett. I'm the Leasehold and Commercial Services Manager from Housing. I asked in preparation for this meeting for an update on where we were at from a couple of our service leads who couldn't be here today. One of those particularly being Alison Croucher, who's our Sheltered Housing Manager. Alison's come back to me to explain that there was a significant issue with communication between the discharge teams and sheltered housing. That has now been resolved. Scheme managers are now invited to discharge planning meetings for more of the complex cases. It's very, very positive for the sheltered housing managers, who are noticing a huge improvement in the hospital discharge, and they are seeing they are being able to share their knowledge of the resident with the hospital, which is what's important to that process. On occasions where it's a short-term hospital admission that doesn't require a discharge planning meeting, if the sheltered housing manager finds that they have an issue, they're able to then directly contact the hospital, and they've been doing that and it's been working.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you. And actually, Jo's comments link to recommendation C, which is talking about relevant sheltered housing professionals being invited to attend discharge planning meetings, and just to reassure you that that is happening. And just in addition, with the introduction of the integrated discharge service, and we've also getting some housing resource into the integrated discharge service to support us with hospital discharge, particularly around telecare options for people. I think the relationships in general with our own housing service are significantly improved.
Councillor Tom Wood.
Can I just quickly, I may be being overly cautious. I've just noticed something that I think only appears on page 20 of the report, but it mentions some work done by the Red Cross. So I should possibly declare a non-prejudicial inquest. I'm employed by the Red Cross. I work in a completely different department to that, so I had no idea even from my day job they're involved in that. But just having seen that, just to be absolutely safe, to declare an interest there. Sorry about that, Scott.
That's perfectly fine. Rather to be safe than sorry. Do we have any questions? Councillor Hastings?
Thank you, Chair. Just to wrap up on that one, is it to be clear, because of method now, we no longer would need a next of kin status or any replacement of within the council? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Any other questions before we move on? Councillor Sanders?
Yes. In the when the Cabinet discussed this in March 2015, the minutes say that Councillor Steve Williams talked about duplication that could be further investigated, such as both the City Council and the NHS employing their own occupational therapists. I assume he means having one set of occupational therapists across the two services. Has that been explored, and if not, why not?
I don't think it's been explored in terms of the hospital context from my perspective. We do have in the community OTs employed by the City Council, but we also have OTs employed by Southern Health. Sorry, it's not Southern Health, Solent NHS Trust, and then we do have the hospital OTs. Some of those jobs are quite distinct and different, and then we could ask for that to be looked at again. I think that the jobs are quite different, so there are OTs in the community that might reach into the hospital and support with assessments for people coming home, but there are OTs that will be working in the hospital on specific tasks related to maybe specific conditions.
Any more questions? Happy to move on to the next point.
Okay. Recommend D, this related to care agencies feeding back relevant information to the discharge planning team. Just to reassure everybody that this is included in the policy framework that our domiciliary care agencies sign up to. So it's part of the requirements set out and the standards that we expect of dom care agencies.
Questions from members? No, happy to move on. We on to the next point, Rachel.
Really, in terms of point E, this was in relation to families and patients being involved in the discharge planning process. And really just to say on this point that the Care Act kind of really strongly reaffirms that this requirement, and we do have a commissioned advocacy provider to ensure patients who need support during assessment can access it, recognising that not every patient in hospital has a family member that can support them with that. Work starts with patients and their families at the point of admission. The social care services may not get involved till later on, but people are spoken to at the start of their stay in preparation for planning for their discharge. In addition, Portsmouth Hospital Trust have refreshed their choice protocol, which sets out clearly how discharge planning will progress and what the hospital may do where there are delays that the family are attributed to the family.
Councillor Lyon?
Briefly, if I look at the E, which is presumably the recommendation and the answer, it strikes me that it looks as though what's happening is the patients and families are involved at the beginning, but the patient has an advocacy provided, or advocacy service presumably provided to the patient, it isn't clear that the families are also involved in that. Is it exclusive to the patient? Is it? I mean, let's assume we're talking about a patient who has, for example, dementia of some kind. How does the advocacy provision help that patient, or is it actually available to families as well?
The advocacy, so the requirement of the Care Act is that people are offered advocacy if they would have substantial difficulty in being involved in their assessment without it. So the advocacy service is primarily provided to those patients who don't have anyone to support them. The social work team work very closely with relatives and family members, because primarily it is recognised the value of the caring role often they are providing, and a significant number of people wouldn't be able to go home without the support of their family, so they are, in terms of the social work assessment, very, very much involved, and we often delay assessments to allow family members to be present. It's part of the reason why we're looking at more weekend work, so that we can facilitate families being present for assessments.
So I'm not quite sure that completely answered the question, because let's take an example of somebody who is unable to handle this themselves, the patient unable to. The family has, they've been admitted to hospital for some reason, and the family is involved in the discharge process, as you say, from the beginning. But if there is a family there, does the patient not have an advocate? Does the advocate act for the patient? Does he or she act for the family? How does it work? So the question I'm trying to ask is I don't see that the answer you've put is an answer directly to the recommendation.
A patient would only have an advocate if they didn't have a family member that could support them. So if the patient has got a family member that can support them, then they wouldn't have an advocate, unless the family was so opposed to what was being planned, in which case the patient may get an advocate anyway. But that sort of strays off into the Mental Capacity Act and best interest meetings, which is a whole different kind of area of practice.
Sorry to press this point. We are talking about the people that effectively bed block for reasons such as this, that they are not given access to the right kind of information. They may not themselves be able to understand what's going on. How is it that an advocate is appointed if the family objects particularly to whatever strategy occurs? Who makes the decision as to who is appointed and for how long and on what terms? How does it work? In other words, how do we get from a position where you have a patient who is incapable, for whatever reason, of making their own decisions, or is deemed to be, the family then decides that they don't agree with whatever somebody else has proposed, and I'm assuming that's social services or adult social care that has done that. How does it, just talk me through the process of how an advocate happens, what the advocate does, who pays the advocate, who is the advocate responsible to, and how can a patient who's not in a position to argue for his or herself appoint an advocate?
If a patient is not in a position to make an informed decision about their discharge destination, so they are deemed to lack capacity to decide that, there would need to be a best interest meeting which the local authority would chair. Now, 99% of the time, families are usually supportive of the plans that are in place, and those plans would proceed. If the family are not supportive of the plans in place, but the remaining professionals believe it's in the person's best interest, for instance, to go home, or in the person's best interest to go to a nursing home, and there is continued objection from the family, the advocate would be appointed to give a view on behalf of the patient, and the matter would need to go before the court for a determination, because we cannot just move somebody. We can move somebody on their best interest if everyone's in agreement with that, But if there are significant objections, we just don't lawfully have the right to say, sorry, this person must leave. So the matter would go before the court. It's very rare that that happens.
Who appoints the advocate?
The local authority.
Councillor Sanders, you've waited patiently.
Thank you. Points E and F go together because they come from some of the evidence that we received, which was that there was disagreement between the health professionals who believed that the patient was good enough to go home and the family who said basically, no, we can't look after them. I'm distilling about 5 hours of evidence into 5 words, but basically we can't look after them. Now you can have a whole raft of reasons for that. Some are good, some aren't. But that was the problem that we faced. And that's why we put forwards the need to involve the families as often as possible, in as early as possible and throughout as many stages as possible. And I think Ian's point around basically who decides if there's a breakdown between the family and the patient, ultimately it's the local authority who decides, because the local authority appoints the advocate, does not fit with the spirit of the evidence that we were given, because the spirit of the evidence was to try and involve the families, but recognising that sometimes the families were completely wrong. And the families had their own reasons often to make sure they didn't go home, but very often they have very good reasons why they shouldn't go home, and very often the families were right. So that was the spirit behind those two. I've cut across those two, and I'll have my comments about F when we get there. But that has come from a real sense that came through from the professionals who gave us evidence that essentially families were not being involved, and part of the problem will be to talk to families to see if practical objections can be overcome and good objections be included. Thank you, Scott.
Okay, we'll move on that point. Do you want to go on to F now?
Well, I think we've started to cover it. I mean, there was a requirement for there to be one care plan for each patient being discharged. From the local authority's point of view, we have legal requirements in terms of assessments under the Care Act and support plans, which we would need to provide. Where all the planning is recorded in one place is the documentation that's held within Bedview, which is what is used to support professionals in coordinating discharge arrangements, and it's designed to minimise conflicting and confusing information being given to families about their discharge arrangements. So I don't know, I mean, I guess I haven't got anything more to say. I'll just take questions on that bit.
Any questions, Councillor Sanders?
I have no questions, but I have comments, if I may. This isn't green, because this is not this is not delivering what the panel was looking for, which essentially was a single care plan that everybody has access to, everybody knows, and that patients and families are involved as much as possible in all this. The second paragraph, patients and their families will have access to assessments, but there is not one document currently that contains all relevant information, and there is no plan to develop this. That may be fine, and that's almost certainly true, but that doesn't make it red. Sorry, it doesn't make it green. Thank you, Steve. Because there's no plan, and there's no one document currently that contains all relevant information, which suggests that there will be. Now, it may be that for medical reasons it is impossible to deal with this, or not desirable to deal with this, although this recommendation was supported in 2014-15. But I would respectfully suggest that we change the colour of this slightly to amber, because clearly progress has been made in terms of actually putting it into this Bedview process, but really there is patients and their families do not have access to the information, and there's no plan really to deliver on what the panel wants, which is a shame because of the breakdowns that have occurred previously, which means an increase in trust is required. So I would respectfully suggest that this is changed to amber, but I suspect I should be in a minority of one.
On that point, do you want to take up on that point, Rachel?
If I can just come back to say that from the local authority's perspective, we pull together one care plan that does go to the patient and or their family, if the patient's in agreement, that may have information from an OT, it may have medical information, but I can't with all confidence that it has got every piece of assessment information recorded in it. One of the things that we have done to streamline discharge planning and is to undertake proportionate assessments for patients, recognising that the position they're in when they're in hospital can change quite quickly. So after 3 or 4 weeks of being at home, further assessment will be required. So they will have a support plan which details how their needs will be met. But I couldn't say that we will get agreement that the consultants or the community nurses will all have the opportunity to write onto that one plan. So I was just saying I haven't got a plan to kind of take that action forward. I appreciate that was a recommendation and I wasn't around at the time.
Councillor Lyon.
Sorry, I didn't mean to browbeat anyone on this, but I have 2 questions. The first is, who decides? I mean, the point is professionals are making decisions clearly on behalf of the patient, and we're also talking about a one-size-fits-all scenario. We're not actually trying to say, well, there are those who are much less easy to discharge than others, and unfortunately that means it's very hard to make some kind of judgment as to precisely the elements we're talking about. And there are, as I was going to say afterwards, no figures at all in this which tell me how things have progressed in the last year. So I don't know the size of the problem. I don't know how many people are being discharged. It says in the report it's 2.8 people per 100,000. Is that 2.8 people a year, 2.8 people a day, 3.8 people a month? There is absolutely no comparative information that allows anyone to make an informed judgment on the narratives that are being presented to us. So I would like to know how you differentiate in the IDS between somebody who's on the verge of being able to go home but you're not quite sure about it, someone who definitely can't go home, someone who's got a family that's wildly opposed to it. If I'm going to have green, amber and red, I prefer to deal with it in terms of the patient requirement rather than the narrative, which seems to me, because it has no empirical evidence behind it, to be entirely subjective. I'm taking your word for it, and I'm not trying to be, as I say, I'm not trying to be rude or difficult about it, but I cannot look at the elements and the answers that are being given to the various questions. I'm as blinded by them as anybody else. I have no figures. I don't know how many people are currently lying in beds in the QA who are about to be discharged. I have no idea at all. I don't know the size of the problem. I don't know anything. And all this is doing is saying what we are doing in a roundabout fashion, it seems to me. I know it's obviously progress from there, but it means I think we're finding it very hard to get to the nub of the issue here.
Okay, if I can just come back. What happens in terms of patient discharge is we get an assessment notification from ward staff which tells us that a patient does what it says on the tin, really. A patient is ready to be assessed. And that's when we allocate a social worker to go and undertake that assessment. We then get a discharge notification which gives us the 24 hours notice that the person should be leaving hospital. So as of last week, we had 7 people who were delays to Portsmouth City Council within the hospital because their discharge didn't take place when it was due to, and there were a number of reasons for that. And apologies, I didn't put any data in the report. Coming at it as someone who wasn't involved in the work, presented it as a bit of a challenge. I think it's also important to note that the hospital social work service discharges a relatively small proportion of the patients that leave the hospital, because we pick up the complex patients. There are a significant number. At the beginning of this week for the Portsmouth system, so that's not just social care, there were, and don't quote me on exact numbers, but it was about 259 people assessed as being medically fit. That means that they are ready to be assessed to leave the hospital. We also need to bear in mind that sometimes we go and see people and they're no longer medically fit because they have a temperature or they become unwell again.
That's very useful, but then that's 259 people out of how many? That's 7 people out of how many? I have no sense of perspective on this, and that's the question.
On that point, it's probably not, you're not going to be able to answer the numbers today. Would it be better to circulate that to members afterwards?
If I can just say, the challenge is obviously not all those patients are Portsmouth patients, and I can't tell you how many of those patients are Hampshire patients. I could only make a rough estimate that if there's 2,000 beds in the hospital, this is the number of Portsmouth patients. If this committee would like further information and can stipulate that, very happy to provide it for the future. I appreciate the difficulties people have got.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably the best way to pursue on, move on that one.
Briefly, if the 7 you've just described that at the beginning of the week, is that they've been undischarged for 1 day, 1 week, a month? I mean, on average, we're talking about. So are we looking at a sort of today's date? These people haven't been discharged, but I'd quite like to know: is there a history of those 7 people? Are we talking weeks in some cases, months in some cases, or just days or hours?
Okay, well, we report our delayed discharges from midnight Thursday every week. Most people it's a couple of days. So for last week, 2 people were waiting for residential placements, 2 people were waiting for domiciliary care, 2 people were waiting to be allocated, and 1 person had been allocated but their assessment hadn't been completed. There will be other people who may be longer delays, and not necessarily the responsibility of the local authority, but it does vary. But we do collect that data every week, and if there's a way it can be reported, we have a weekly meeting that looks at every patient that's been in the hospital between 3 and 14 days and 14 days plus, to try and ensure that collectively we know who those people are and that we are progressing plans for them. But again, happy to expand if there's some further information required.
I think further information required is acceptable, so I'm quite happy to do that. Obviously, Councillor Sanders has been waiting patiently again.
Can I make a suggestion, if I may, Scott? I mean, the chairman of the Health and Overview Scrutiny Panel is here, and I know that the panel has been looking very heavily at the issues around delayed discharge, because certainly my understanding is that there is, how can I put it politely, a slight difference between the overall view from the NHS and the overall view from the council, which is relayed in this report, often in quite stark detail, to the extent that we had to go back to some of the people from the council, say, "You're completely sure you want this in the report?" because it really is quite critical of the health service. So I suspect that figures reported to the Health and Overview Scrutiny Panel on that basis, I'm not going to second guess what Leo might want, might be quite useful, because they're looking into some detail, because I know they are concerned about the processes and they're concerned about the resilience of the system and whether it will survive the winter, because they see the reports from the NHS and the council, like everyone else does, that it's all fine and that there isn't a problem, and we've got more community beds than we need in this city about this particular issue. And throughout the scrutiny panel report, we were told exactly the same thing, only to have 2.5 years of, well, it wasn't fine after all. And I think in order to deliver trust, then I think it would be useful to have the figures and to have a realistic discussion across all partners of the resilience of the system. Because if we don't, then simply no one will believe us. And that makes us look silly. And that was one of the stark things that came out from the report, and I think it's one of the things behind Ian's questioning as well, if I dare second guess Ian. Thank you. But I think it's one of the things that we need to look at, because if the system doesn't work, then this is all lovely, but it's not going to make a hill of beans difference to people in practice. I'm sorry, that's not a question, Scott, but a rant. But it's one of the serious problems with this whole system, and a sense that maybe that came from our panel, a sense that actually the wool was being pulled over our eyes.
I have to admit, I've heard some of your other colleagues rant before, and that was quite tame. So I'm quite happy with that. Does Councillor Madden want to interject at this point? I did drop into hosp yesterday, and the issue of discharge, I sat for it for about an hour and a half. It was quite interesting, so I'll pass over to Councillor Madden.
Could I suggest that we deal with the recommendations and then I'll come in after that, if that's okay, Chair?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Do you want to move on to the next recommendation?
Yeah, I was going to. Joe will also comment on this recommendation. I wasn't able to comment specifically on housing actions, but did want to just make the comment that in terms of our own occupational therapy service, we have had significant work done using the systems intervention approach, and have significantly reduced our waiting list for assessments. And included in that has been a review of the Disabled Facilities Grant. Without some of the background information and being involved in the work at the time, it was difficult for me to have a full understanding of what the issues were. But if I hand over to Jo, she can comment on housing action.
Over to you, Jo.
Thank you. For the purpose of this answer, I'm Bruce Lomax, the Housing Standards Manager, who couldn't be with us today. Therefore, questions will be very difficult for me because I have a prepared script, which I can't deviate from. So Bruce has explained to me that they're currently recruiting for a new role of telecare advisor to be based at QA, who will liaise with the hospital discharge team and other professionals, and the service will include a full home safety inspection, installation of telecare equipment, and installing other safety measures, grab rails, small ramps, handrails, etc. Within a patient's home. This will be within 2 hours of the referral being made. We'll also be supplying the QA discharge team with specific portable telecare equipment, which will allow a patient to be discharged out of hours, but still have support until a full assessment and installation can be undertaken. Following the review of how the DFG process is undertaken, we're working on reducing the end-to-end times down of the delivery process. Further meetings are being held with the BCF on how we can use the discretionary element of the monies to further reduce the time a customer has to wait for the adaptations to be completed. We do have a list of all the properties that have been adapted within the private market and what adaptations have been undertaken. However, it is very hard to influence who can benefit from those adaptations should the property be sold. We obviously already had a list of the adaptations in local authority housing properties. And Bruce has been working with partner RSLs who do use the Section 106 monies to provide affordable adapted properties within Portsmouth.
Any questions, members? Councillor Dowling?
Thank you, Chair. I think it'd be useful to hear from Councillor Sanders exactly why the panel felt this was such a useful action. The reason being that, and it's difficult with Bruce not here, but from the sounds of that update, it sounds like lots of positive things have happened to try and get to the same outcome as the suggested recommendation, but it sounds like there was no progress on the recommendation itself, and it would be useful to kind of understand why that was. It may be for an entirely valid reason. It sounds like the work that's happened is really positive, but in terms of reviewing the recommendations from the report, it would be quite useful to kind of have a better understanding of that. But maybe Councillor Sanders can shed some more light on it.
I will respectfully pass over to Councillor Sanders.
You can disrespectfully pass over as well if you want. Ben beat me to it. Ben beat me to it, which is why you didn't get an answer. The logic behind this was that we had a whole series of people who needed to get into properties, but part of the problem was the supply of properties. There are some places that are adapted. We know there are some private rented places that are adapted, except nobody knew where they were. And that was a bit of a problem. And so what the need was to have a register, both private housing association and council, of properties that had been suitably adapted, so it would be easier to fit in. One of the other recommendations, and we'll come to it in a bit, is around actually trying to increase the supply of accommodation for people with disabilities, and also adapted accommodation for people with disabilities. That's one of the things we're very keen to do, but clearly, as always with anything involving housing in the city, the answer is where. If it's okay, we can ask a question, although it's not strictly on this topic of Joe, which is that we've got a Portsmouth plan that's under review, which we didn't have 4 years ago. We didn't have a review 4 years ago. Do you think it would be sensible to include in that plan, particularly in the strategic sites bit of that plan, a recommendation that there be a certain percentage over and above what is normally required of accommodation that can be either easily adapted or adapted for relevant people, as that will help increase the supply, which is behind this. And I think we may be in a position to move from amber to mildly green on this one as a result of Joe's comments. But also, would it be sensible to have a proportion or priority for accommodation for people with disabilities within the Portsmouth Plan, and particularly a percentage for each of the strategic residential sites.
Okay. With regard to the overall list, so to come back to the point that you made there, some of that I do know from my work in supported housing. So having a list of every property that is adapted isn't useful if you don't have access to the property. So we know every private home that is adapted, we know every property that we can allocate that is adapted. If you're coming to us needing to be allocated a property, it doesn't matter if Mrs. Miggins from number 3 such and such road who has a private home has had her home adapted. So it's about holding the information in a place that it's useful to you to be able to access, not having things in there that don't need to be there, and making sure that, for example, the housing options team have the information about all of the housing in the sector that they can allocate that allows them to make the right decision. So there are registers of everything, but if you've got a private individual like me, say, who has a DFG in their home done, the relevance of that to the hospital discharge process, for example, would be difficult. Sorry, a DFG is a Disabled Facilities Grant. So I hope that answers that one in as much as detail as I can. With regard to my knowledge of adapted property and the needs of adapted property, as you know, come from my work in the supported housing portfolio and also in the council housing stock. So we hold a list of properties and circumstances that we need to meet the needs of a particular individual. Those individuals, the only way that I have found to look at those cases is on a single one-by-one basis, and to actually map the pathways of housing to make sure that you have capacity to house a number of people. In some circumstances, you don't actually need to create new housing, you need to use what you've got differently. In other circumstances, I would only be able to meet someone's need by building a new property. So it's very difficult for me at this point. In the other scrutiny topic that we have, you know, I've been talking to you about the fact that we're in the process of mapping the needs that the city has. I can't state to you whether or not we need an allocation of a particular percentage, because I don't know if it would be practical or useful, given that what I've learnt so far of the 150 people that we've placed is that every one of them needed something, that their case was reviewed, we looked at them specifically and we worked out how to house them within the constraints that we have. I don't know that if you were saying, for example, I need 5% of all new build to meet this client group's need, I don't know if it would work. Potentially, I would love to know the answer to that. And as our work continues in supported housing, I'm sure that we'll get there and understand it further. But at this point, I don't have enough information on the demand or the pathway to know whether or not that is something that would be useful.
I'm happy with that answer. I know it's something that we spoke about before at Planning Committee about adapted housing, so it's quite important. Moving on to the next point, Rachel.
Okay, just in relation to recommend H in terms of improving relationships, I think the development of the integrated discharge service has had a significant impact. People working together, obviously sitting in the same room, and being able to have quick discussions about patients, and actually being able to be more cooperative because you're not trying to get hold of people on the phone. I also think that the behaviour is mirrored within the senior management group, so we meet on a fortnightly basis. So myself as a senior manager and representatives from Southern, Solent and Hampshire along with the hospital, and then there's an overarching integrated service discharge service lead, Paul Thomas, who has an overarching kind of brief in terms of making sure that services are collaborative. It hasn't been all plain sailing, but it is certainly in terms of the hospital. I think we've got much better relationships than I believe we had a couple of years ago. Obviously, I wasn't around.
Any questions, members? No, move on to the next point.
Yeah, no.
Breathe easy.
Yeah. And I say some of this in the context of my previous job was managing hospital social work across the whole of West Sussex. So I have had experience of working with, in that scenario, 3 different acute hospital trust. So I can say with confidence that things are better than they were. In terms of recommendation 9, this relates to being able to discharge people outside of the working week. At the moment, in the past, Portsmouth have had a 7-day service. The requirement to make savings meant that that was reviewed, and that service was reduced back down to 5 days. But that, I think that decision just before my time was reviewed. At the moment, we have 7-day working in place on a voluntary basis, in that people can choose and be paid to work on Saturdays or Sunday, but there's no contractual requirement. From a social work perspective within the hospital social work team, we have 7-day working across PRRT, which is our reablement and rehab service, which is funded by Adult Social Care to facilitate discharges over 7 days. We also allow ward staff to restart care within a 7-day time frame. So if somebody comes into hospital, we don't immediately cancel their package of care, so we keep funding it for up to 7 days. So that means that if somebody goes in on a Friday lunchtime and is ready to go home Sunday morning, that the ward staff can phone the care provider and restart that care to enable them to go home. So at the moment, there's work being undertaken to look at how we would configure ourselves over 7 days if we contracted people to do that, thinking about things like whether it's a good thing to have people working Thursday to Monday, so we cover and have handovers during the week. We're not looking to have separate people. But and there's also work to be done to kind of explore how we might do things differently with our Hampshire colleagues, who obviously also on site and do currently work 7 days with staff contracted.
Do members have any questions? Councillor Sanders?
Thanks, Scott. It sounds like this should be amber because progress is being made, but then you're not there yet. When are you planning to formalise 7-day working?
Well, we need to. We're in the process of putting a bid into the Adult Transformation Fund to get some additional resource to kind of test out the right model, because it's not entirely clear exactly how much staff would we need, and we need to test out how we employ staff. We don't want to go into whole-scale reorganisation of the way of our staff in terms of kind of their contracted hours without being able to test a few things out. So the feeling was from our director that being able to overstaff a little bit and look at different ways of working would be the best way forward. We currently do have staff working at the weekend, so they are. The reason I've put it green in that it was continued effort to be made to encourage weekend and evening discharges, which we are doing. What we don't have is a permanent service, but we do have people working at the weekends. The emphasis being is the fact that it's voluntary rather than a formalised arrangement. So sorry, to answer your question, I think we would be looking at least April to have contracted people in place. PHT are funding somebody at the moment that does work for us Thursday to Monday with a particular focus on their frailty unit and A&E section of the hospital.
If I may, which April are you referring to?
Apologies, April 2018.
So next April, okay. If the bid from the Adult Transformation Fund doesn't happen, what then happens to the prospects of it being formalised?
Good question. I think we would we still have 7-day working. We would just need to think again about. I think we would need to sit down and think about whether we start when we recruit new people, changing the contracts. Having some additional resource just helps you to think through what you're trying to do and gives you a bit of leeway, because the hospital, as you can imagine, the hospital social work team is flat out. There's very little thinking time and there's very little opportunity to try different things out, particularly over the winter, where it's all hands to the deck every day.
I understand. If I may just pursue this line, Scott. Thank you for that. Roughly, how much is the bid for? It's not 50p.
No, no, it's not. It's not 50p. It would be about £80,000, give or take. It's around the cost of 2 additional social work staff.
And if the bid fails, is it the sort of thing that you would be asking out of the 18-19 budget process?
I think if the bid fails, we would look at using our existing resources. It just means that what we've got we'd have to stretch over 7 days, and what we wanted was the opportunity to just front load it for a little while so we could test out some different ways of doing it. But if we're not able to do that, we will as a minimum continue with what we're doing, because we do have people working at the weekends. It's just that it would be useful to have it more formalised.
Sounds like an investor safe prospect waiting to happen.
I actually get that as reallocating the resources in a different way, but obviously the service at the moment is working across 7 days, so I get the point of actually at the moment that is at a minimum, but I do take the point of, well, if we don't get the transformation money, I think it's a fair point.
Sorry, for those of us working slightly on Australian time to deal with cricket, this time in the afternoon is a dead time to be totally concentrating. So I don't know whether I missed what I can't quite understand, apart from the fact that open froze 7 days doesn't quite work. It says PCC keep care packages open for 7 days for people admitted to hospital. Does that mean that somebody has been in care or had a care package provided, they go into hospital, and after 7 days their access to that package ceases if they are still in hospital? That I mean, sorry, just if I can.
Sorry.
So I mean, it's a bit like the pension system. If you're in hospital for 6 weeks, you lose your state pension for that period for some reasons I can't understand. When you have possibly a wife at home who needs to heat the house, are you saying that that is a resource issue, or it is a policy issue, or and how difficult it is to re-access that care package? And would it not? I mean, it might encourage people to try to get out of hospital within 7 days, but the moment the 7 days are past, the prospect of getting back into a care package might be so hideously appalling that it would be a driver to remain in hospital, perhaps.
In my experience, most people are really keen to get home. Actually, they don't want to stay in hospital, they want to get back home. The reason, as I understand it, it's not my decision, but the reason, as I understand it, is that if someone's going to be in hospital for 3 weeks, we wouldn't want to pay for their care for that 3 weeks when it could be reallocated to somebody else, because there'd be another person waiting to leave hospital. You're probably all aware that we do have one of the challenges that we do have in relation to hospital discharge is sourcing domiciliary care at times, particularly peak times. So, I mean, if somebody was going to be going home in 9 days, we're not going to stop it, and we take a pragmatic approach to it. But by and large, if somebody's not out within the 7 days, the likelihood is that their needs are more complex and they're going to be longer. And so, generally speaking, it's not difficult to restart care, other than the rider that we do have particular challenges, particularly around Christmas, Easter and summer holidays, where less carers are working.
Any more questions, members, before we move on? I think you're moving on to the last point.
Okay, I'm going to answer a little part of this, and then Joe will fill in. What I just wanted to say in relation to accommodation people with a physical disability is that from a social care perspective within Maritime House, which is one of our extra sheltered housing schemes, we did commission a number of flats to provide wheelchair access to meet the needs of younger people with disability who might also have significant care and support needs, and I'm advised by our Deputy Director that this approach would be adopted in all future developments.
Thank you. With regard to the PCC builds, so the ones that are coming through from the Housing Revenue Account, the request for what we would put on any building site comes through our Housing Options Manager, who we look initially at what the site is able to deliver in terms of planning, so what is the likely makeup of that site. We would then look to our accessible housing waiting list to look at what are the needs that we currently can't meet, can we design against those needs, and then include those properties within the scheme. Likewise, Bruce's team, a gentleman in Bruce's team, works with the RSLs to do exactly the same thing. So we're trying at all times to meet the needs of that list through how we either build ourselves, how our partners build, and also in terms of the properties that we acquire and the properties that we refurbish.
Any questions, members? Councillor Sanders?
The line says this approach will be adopted in all future developments, Joe. How does that square with your earlier comment that you can't have a fixed, or you don't know if it's possible to have a fixed percentage of such properties?
Thank you, Darren. Sorry, Councillor Sanders. It would square in the fact that not every development is suitable for the addition of that type of property. So in some of my developments, for example, if I was looking at, I have just looked at a challenging behaviour unit. It's a 10-bed challenging behaviour unit. It's for people who have quite difficult behaviours. In that situation, it wouldn't be suitable, for example, to have someone who was immobile in a wheelchair. So every development has to be looked at on its merits and whether or not there is the suitability to include a particular type of property within that.
Please carry on.
That's right. So the answer is some future developments, which is fine and accurate. I just wanted to endorse what you said. Certainly when the previous administration approved building on places like the Eastern Road and on the Rubber Park down in Portsea, we were envisaging development of a particular type, as well as in places like the old Somerstown Health Centre and at Southsea Community Centre, which the previous administration approved as affordable housing developments. Those things have clearly changed. Those plans have clearly changed as the market has clearly changed. Has the needs of people with physical disabilities influenced what is now going up, which is more flats, rather than what the previous administration was looking for, which is more family homes, because we thought that was the need? Has the approach of needing more accommodation for people with physical disabilities influenced that change of approach?
Thank you. What's changed is that we had, at the point that we requested permission to build on a set number of sites and to look at what those sites would be, we were at initial feasibility stage. Once we worked out, for example, if I look at site A, B and C, site A may be a terrific site for 2 terraces of housing that provide great family, 3-bed accommodation with a really nice garden. In that circumstance, I would be looking at the accessible housing list to identify where, for example, a child within the family may be living in a wheelchair and would need to have a home built to a higher specification to allow them to access all areas of the home and to take part in family life. I also might be looking at, I've got one family that we're just about to house where the parent has a degenerative spinal condition but is the main carer for a very large group of children. I say very large, it's only 3, but it's a lot for me, it's more kids than hands. They are needing to be able to change beds, access bathrooms, clean kitchens, all of those kind of things. So in that situation, that family housing and every other type of housing that we have is assessed to see whether or not there is someone with a physical disability that we can meet the needs of. Bruce would be able to speak to it much more eloquently than I, but there is a reality that the archetypes of housing within this city don't generally lead themselves to adaptation. So, for example, I live in a, typically styled Portsmouth home. It's got a narrow corridor. It would be very difficult to extend, etc., etc. It's a terraced house. There are properties and areas within the city that have different archetypes of housing where it's very easy, for example, to build an extension, put in a wet room, so on. Likewise, if I'm looking at a property, you referenced the one at the end of the Eastern Road, what we did there was we had to look at, one, what is the capacity of this site, what is the planning requirement, what will it look like? I couldn't have put houses there even if I wanted to. I would also not be maximising the development potential of the site, and what I have to be looking at in all times is how can we best look at this site, spend money and develop to meet the needs of the people from this city. Those needs potentially as well don't always sit alongside each other. So if I have a group of people who I particularly need to be near city centre, accessing a day service, able to access bus routes close to their community, I wouldn't be wanting to put them out on the Euston Road, miles away from everything. But likewise, it hasn't changed the makeup of sites. What predominantly changes the makeup of site is what's around it. If I'm looking at an open field type site that has the capacity for me to be able to go, oh, I'll have one of them and one of them and one of them, then we would look at what it is that Elaine Bastable, our housing options manager, needs to meet the needs of first. And we'd be saying to Elaine, tell me what's your highest level of priority. So at certain times we've built really large family homes. At other times we've built 2 and 3 bedroom properties in order to create a churn. Whatever type of property and whatever size of property you create, generally those people are moving from somewhere else. So you do create a movement within the housing stock. And the point to develop is that effectively you want to be creating those moves and making sure that your housing stock is maximised to its fullest potential so that you have the right people living in the right property. At the moment, our highest demand is for 1-bedroom property, and that's because of the change in our understanding of how people are coming into the need for supported housing, adult learning disability accommodation, mental health accommodation, single person accommodation. So we map continually what's in our stock, what's in the RSL stock, what's within the city's archetype, and what are the gaps and how do we fill them, and that's what we design for. But even if I wanted 21-bed flats, there are certain sites where they would only be suitable for houses.
Any comments, members? Open up to discussion on the points we've heard. Who would like to go first? I think we go to Councillor Madden. I think he's been waiting long enough.
I've been patiently waiting.
Is
Is he the only one to patiently wait?
You are always patient.
Thank you very much. I have to say, from a HOS perspective, we've had this, hospital discharge on the agenda now for many years. And I presume that was the reason for this report in the first place. I think it's the first time I've actually seen this report, or recall seeing this report, and I just wondered, if anybody remembers, when we're talking about on page 4 of the report, the number of people discharged remains low, or it says on the first conclusion, adult social care told the panel that Portsmouth discharges were already 4 in 13-14, which is low. I have to say, but I presume that just means Portsmouth and not the area covered by QAH. Okay, well that's good. Just to say about HOSP, of course, as you will know, HOSP has not only got cross-party representation from Portsmouth, UKIP being the only party not on it simply because of the proportionality rules that we've got, and representatives from Hampshire, from the local authorities and Hampshire itself. So we got people from Gosport, Havant, Fareham, East Hants and Hampshire. So when we're looking at it, we're looking at the round, so we're looking at the overall discharges from the hospital, or if you're discharged, if you're ready to be discharged as a Portsmouth resident, you are called medically fit for discharge. If you're outside of Portsmouth, you're a DTOC. You are a delayed transfer of care. They're both the same things, and it means that people are waiting to come out of hospital. A couple of points have been made, and I've just picked this up from papers we've got. There are 1,200 beds in QAH. 3 weeks ago, and if I say medically fit for discharge, I mean the whole lot rather than just Portsmouth. When I say that, it was 301, which is a high. You've got that number from yesterday, which is a high number now, but it's about, and it's only approximate. A third of that is Portsmouth, and 2/3 is Hampshire. The experts tell us, and Rachel mentioned Paul Thomas, and I think if you're going to have any future meetings, it'd be useful to invite him along to it, because he's got the overall integrated lead, as Rachel said. But he says, and other professionals say, that the number of patients on any day with the discharge should be about 108, meaning that there are too many people waiting, and therefore the chances are that operations could be cancelled and all the rest of it. So that's part of the problem itself. About 130 patients a day, we are told, actually come into the hospital, and sometimes there's more are admitted than actually leave the hospital. I suppose we're back to that old. Your report mentioned it. I think it's an old-fashioned word now, but bed blocking is really what people are concerned about. And of course, so is the Department of Health, because the Department of Health have said, you know, if local authorities don't get their act together, we will fine you. I was speaking to the chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board, Councillor Stubbs, the other day about it, and he reckons it's highly unlikely. And I think it's highly unlikely because actually, to be fair, we are doing what we can as a local authority to make sure that patients are discharged when they can be from hospital. The legislation itself, the social care and NHS legislation allows for 72 hours for discharge plan to be put in place. So you can be in hospital for 3 days without a plan, if you like. But as Rachel will tell you and others will tell you, that's not the case. As soon as you arrive in the hospital, people are looking to see when you could possibly be coming out. One of the alternatives to hospital care, as we've been looking at them, of course, there's we have domiciliary care, which is something, and that's been mentioned by various people, or some care, or provision of care home or whatever in the interim, in order to say that people are discharged from hospital and sitting where some people, as I think Rachel said, won't accept the package on offer. And there's not much, when you're involved in families, as point 3 Ian was made, there's not much you can do about it when they say we don't want this package and give various reasons for it. It's not the majority of people, but nevertheless, some people just don't want the package on offer. But packages are discussed with the patient, packages are discussed with the families as well, and in the main it works, because what we have found, or what the hospital people found it, and I have to say I've never spent a night in hospital, so I have no idea, about these arrangements myself, is that most people want to be out of hospital as soon as possible. So it takes a medical person to say they're fit for discharge, and then the whole operation, as Rachel starts and trying to get people back into their own homes. I talked about enhanced domiciliary care. I suppose the problem that we have as hospice, that we were told back in the summer that by the end of September there would be no more than 150 people waiting to be discharged, and that's across the whole of the area itself, and we see that figure rising, and there will be cancellations of operations unless other alternatives are found by Spire and other ones like that. But I have to say that all the evidence we have is that Port City Council, Hampshire County Council, the CCGs across the area, and Solent Health, of course, are committed to putting resources into the domiciliary care bit. Now, I'm not a cynic by birth, I have to say, but I've been very cynical about some of the figures that we've been given about how many people there would be at any given time to be discharged. And it's difficult for the hospitals, and I think the hospitals probably get an unfair coverage over this because they're seen to be blamed, whereas there, as has been explained, and as you will know, there's other elements involved, including social services and all the rest of it. But we are told that the situation that Paul Thomas told us, which I think it would be useful to help him along, because he told us that there would be a significant improvement will be noted in all areas by next summer. Okay. Now, and I think that's a fair point, and I think that's what panels want to hear. They don't want to hear that there's a solution just around the corner and everything will be fine, everything will be hunky-dory, which is what hosts tend to hear and challenge. So we're saying this integrated system is bedding in. I think it was the idea of the domiciliary bit, I think mainly Rachel came from Solent Health, I think, with the sort of drivers in relation to that. But there are people sitting there waiting to be discharged. One of the little things we found out yesterday, and I don't know if you heard Peter Miller say it, was that when the registrar goes around in the morning and decides you can be discharged, would you need to take some pharmaceuticals with you or something? Yeah, you've got to wait until he's finished his round. Yeah, little things like that, may well speed things up. But I think that's only, so you're not discharged that day, you're discharged the next day. So I think, I'm not too sure it'll make much difference to the figures itself. But it is a problem. It has been addressed, and of course it was brought up by CQC themselves anyway, in relation to this. We're not the only hospital in that situation. But I would say, if asked, and I'm asking myself, what's the situation in Portsmouth in relation to people being discharged? I would say it's satisfactory. I would say it's Hampshire, and to be fair to Hampshire, we are fine, aren't we? We talked about, densely populated cities. So we've got a short area to cover, whereas Hampshire are talking about the rural areas and all the rest of it. But they are tending to get their act together, I'm told. But in relation to the Portsmouth bit, I would think that, you know, all that can be done is being done at the minute, but obviously there's room for improvement, and this tenant care option and all the rest of it would be a fantastic added to it. Okay, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Madden. Councillor Owen.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank you for taking the trouble to take a report that you haven't written and looking into it. And if I've been harsh, it's because I think the issue is terribly important. And my worry at the moment is that we're going to find a way around the problem rather than solving it. I think one of the ways that actually, from the point of view of the councillors, in much the same way that we're corporate parents and don't, well, I suppose we're beyond one, but we don't know enough about those we are corporately parenting, not as much as I do, for example, about my daughter. But the problem is that if we're going to be fined as a council, or have the possibility of being fined as a council, then it's more likely that those who are concerned with the council's reputation rather than necessarily the patients will try to find an ingenious way to prevent that from happening without actually dealing fundamentally with the core problem. And I wonder whether or not it would be sensible to have a weekly update in the same way that some of you do, because I don't sit on the committees that you do, that say how many people have been, to use a quaint old phrase, but we know what it means, bed blocking, and how many have been discharged and then readmitted within a week, for example, with the same problem. So it'd be interesting to know how many people we actually shoo out the door because we can, and not those that we can't do. And of course there is one other point that is the elephant in the room, which is that if you are discharged straight from hospital by the NHS to a care home, you don't have to pay for it. And if you are not, and you go home and go to a care home, you do have to pay for it. It's a really interesting reason why some people do not want to be discharged to home rather than go straight into a care package that actually won't cost the family anything. So these kind of issues and these kind of considerations, I think, are clouding what's happening. I imagine you have an extremely difficult job as a result in many respects, and I'm sure you may well find yourself occasionally wondering about the motives of families or even patients as to how this happens. But it would be very useful for us as councillors to see a weekly update. I mean, just bullet points. I mean, reading reports is not one of my favourite things to do, although I do when I'm asked to. But something that keeps us appraised of how we're doing, what's happening, and numbers. I'm afraid numbers. I'm a big numbers person. It does help. Thank you.
I'm just going to pass over back to Councillor Madden. On that point, though, before I do, while I sort of agree with what you're saying, I think that would be more a case for HOSP to look at than this committee. Councillor Madden's, that's within his remit, not for us to look at.
Actually, it's a very interesting point. What we do get are monthly figures, Ian. But across the country, and then Portsmouth is highlighted to show us how we're comparing to other authorities. I don't know if that'd be good, and I could ask for that information to be sent to everybody anyway, in order for you to see what discharges. I'll ask Democratic Services to do that. But you have made some interesting points, Ian, which I hadn't thought about, whether people are resisting being discharged and because there's another avenue open to them, if you like, and I think that's something worth looking at. So if you're happy with monthly figures, we can show, but they are bald figures, that's all they are, but you'll have them and then you can compare to other authorities. I'll ask Vicky if she take that on board, yeah? Thank you.
Yeah. We're just conscious that we don't want to take away from the work that HOSP are doing, but we're quite happy to have those figures come to us.
I think your remit's a lot wider than what HOSP does, so that's fair enough, isn't it? Yeah.
It's really just an awareness thing. It's as councillors, we are responsible for certain things. If we're Ofsteded and all the rest of it, we should have some idea of various things about which I probably don't have any idea and should do.
Councillor Sanders?
Only if there's no one else.
Is there anyone else? No,
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's very strange rereading a report after 3 years of what's gone on, especially on a topic like this, which has led to the QA losing £8 million of government money it could have had because its systems weren't good enough in this particular issue. The numbers change not just on a weekly basis, Ian, but on a daily basis. That's part of the problem. And everybody is desperate not to get the blame for something that is highly emotional and highly sensitive. So the figures that Leo's been putting forwards of around 100 or so people who need to be discharged are 5 times more than figures I got 3 months ago, for instance. And it's what do you do with the system? And to me, there seems to have been some Sorry, Leo.
So it'd be 108 people actually sitting there who haven't been discharged. Is that what you meant, rather than being discharged on the day? Sorry.
My ward colleague Councillor Stagg bans me from using the word bed blocking, but it's people who need to get out and who are medically fit to leave hospital. I think that's your phrase. And that's not acceptable. And it's too high a level. And in this report, I think the panel got a sense that actually the wool was being pulled over our eyes. Things were being told it was better than it actually was. And some of the evidence the last 2.5 years has reinforced that, leading to the loss of the £8 million. Again, I'd want to thank both of you for coming along and subjecting yourself to a light grilling by us, or Ian, me and Leo, basically, for which thank you very much. There's been some progress, I think, in terms of what's been going on. In some places, significant progress, which is very, very helpful. I think Scott, there are still some issues that we need to tease out, and I think reading this and thinking about it more, for me, the notion of some halfway house, some interim care home, possibly on a site that might be available, would be quite useful, because I think it'll deal with many of the points that Ian has raised. It's not just change your IT and it'll get sorted. There are too many complex and emotional issues in this. I do not know what progress has been made with regards to Council's motion in August with regards about writing to the NHS Trust about bringing forward plans for an interim care home, ideally on a hospital site that might be going spare in Milton. But that would be quite useful if such progress had occurred, because I think that's the answer to the problem. You put forward some brilliant solutions, and thanks to both of you for being so proactive in all this. But I think there's possibly one stage more, which is just to offer some security and some assistance of a halfway house, which will deal with many of the problems that Ian and Leo have rightly raised. But I think on behalf of my own panel, thank you very much for this, and it's pleasing that some progress has been made, and I hope there's the will to make further progress. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Councillor Sanders. That was enlightening. If we have any more questions, I'm happy to. No, cool. Do you want to go for it now, Ben? I'm quite happy.
Chair, I just thought I thought this was a really useful exercise, and I remember at last meeting we kind of discussed other previous reports that we want to come back to. Would yourself or perhaps Vicky be able to remind us what we said we would next look at? As I think it's been a useful exercise.
We were looking at the retail aspect. I think was the next one from the EDCL panel, not last year before. That was the review that we were going to do secondary. So that will be more than likely into the new year now.
Thank you, Chair. I think that's useful.
Yeah, on that note, I'm happy to close the meeting. I mean, we're the review's happy done. But what I will say with Darren, actually, I think it's a fair point. There has been significant process in this. But I would like to review it again probably in about 3 or 4 months' time, if you're happy to do that. If the committee wants it to come back, I'm happy to bring it back in 3 months' time.
The same thing.
On the action plan. The issues on the action plan.
I think there's good reason to do such a thing. Yeah. I think that would be a good move.
I think we'll bring it back 3 months and take on Councillor Madden's view of getting Paul Thomas to come along as well.
Chair, I'm not suggesting a decision now, but something that you might want to consider is whether or not we consider bringing these reports to committee as decision papers rather than for information papers, just because I think some of the things that have come out of this discussion have been there have been potential actions, but because we're not in a position to give actions, I'm sure lots of points will be taken forward informally, and that's really helpful, but do we want to create a mechanism for ourselves to say this has been really useful to look at this, these are some of the bits that we still think it would be useful to go forward?
On the procedural thing, scrutiny panels are not decision-making panels, so all that the scrutiny panel could do would be to recommend to another body something to be taken on board. So, for example, you could ask for something to go to Cabinet, for example, if that was what the scrutiny management panel wants to do.
Yeah, that's effectively what I had in mind, Chair.
I'm happy to review this in 3 months, and then we'll go from there from another point. I mean, I think we need to review the action plan in 3 months' time with the comments that we've taken on board, but that's not a decision for today.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a procedure thing, especially thinking about the other things we're going to come back and look at. So take the revitalising the local high streets example. We might look at it in January, February time. January. It would be useful for us to have a mechanism within the meeting to be able to say to Cabinet or the relevant Cabinet member, we've had this review of the report. We think these are some of the things that need further consideration, just as an example of something that might come out of that, because currently I know that these guys will very kindly take what we've said and will action things that have come out of the discussion, but I think it would be useful to have a mechanism to do that in a more formal way.
Comments noted. On that point,
just to ask, can we make sure that we do have the figures and stuff that we were talking about?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, the figures will be circulated. Rachel's already informed that. I really want to finish, but I'm going to let Councillor Sanders speak, and after that, nobody else.
One suggestion. In January, when we do each of these scrutiny reports, it might be useful if the chairman or woman of the relevant scrutiny panel is in attendance. Today's been a bit of an advantage because I've been here, so I could talk about my own report.
Yeah.
But if we've got EDCL, then that's quite useful.
On that point, if you look to your left, is the chairman.
Leo,
thank you, Chair. Yes, I am chairman of EDCL now, but the review that we're talking about, I was not even on the panel at the time that review took place. So.
This is the issues that we have. Obviously, the chairman has either moved on, not been re-elected, or no longer sits on the panel. So we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. I'm the vice chair of the EDCL, so I'm in the same boat as you. So we're
for that one particularly, I think it was Councillor Winnington that was chair at the time, and I was on the panel.
Councillor Winnington's on the panel as well. So we'll do the same as we did today. We'll invite the panel members. Everyone's welcome to come. I mean, it's grateful that the chair did turn up for this one, so we'll do the same again. But on that note, I am going to close the meeting. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much, ladies.